Thank you. I would like to thank the organizers and especially Julia for inviting me here and for the talks and presentation that already happened. I hope everything goes right. This is a keynote file, but the tech guys I would like to thank too told me that everything was fine. So I've done this work with Quentin Dufault, who was acting as a postdoc, and David Ponty, who is also a senior researcher. What I'd like to insist is the difference between what has been published already is we actually read the documents. And that's a hard time, you will see, because sometimes they are pretty long and not very much available. And I won't talk at all about negotiations, because you can find, of course, traces of negotiation within the documents, but you don't have access to the behind-the-scenes negotiations that have happened, except when they are being transparent in some way, like we've seen, for example, for University of California or JISC negotiation. So I'm trying to do, if it works, perfect, thank you. So I go quickly, because you all know that, but that will put the scene. So we got from, of course, print books and journals, and we get into the electronic world. We came from individual journals in which the question of a publisher was not important to researcher. It was the journal as the journal, to, of course, very large collections which reinforced, of course, the power of big publisher. It has been said again and again. And we've come, at least for the European scene, from individual libraries to consortium, and especially national consortiums, that have become the sole negotiator for, let's say, providing access to certain resources, journals, books, whatever. So we have a world. This world is the world of closed access and limited access. And not only it is a closed world, but it is a secret world, because most of the agreements between consortiums and publishers were, let's say, negotiated under the idea of a non-disclosure agreement. That is, you couldn't talk about, especially the sums, but also, of course, about the details, the technical details of the agreement. Of course, some freedom of information law, especially in the Netherlands, in England, in Germany, pushed some of this non-disclosure agreement to the side, and we had some information of it. And there's another world, of course, the world of APC journals, the world of diamond journals, and the world of black open access, which is completely apart from what we're talking on the left side. And the only point in common is the hybrid journal. But apart from that, we're in completely two complete different worlds. Until at least the scope initiative. Okay, you all know what is scope, so I won't go about this. The second important step is probably the Finch report in England, which provided lots and lots of money to British, English, mostly Scottish too, and so on, researcher to pay for APC, and that was also the first building of what would be called later offset agreements by JISC. And of course, this white paper in 2015 made by, sorry, I've not made my, I wanted to have a timer. I've not started making my timer. Okay, I'll start it now. I probably talked like 5 minutes. So that's the kind of the background. And you can say that transformative agreements, and I'll come to our definition here, really begins in 2015, even if there are some before. So what we did is really, our research is within the frame of the question of transformation of academic publication business models in OA times. And this specific objective was the case of contracts mixing subscription and OA publication. So that's the very definition of what we gave to TAs. Of course, you can always discuss that, but that means, for example, that if you're taking the German deal agreement with Springer, it's within it. Even if you look inside, it's really 4 agreements put together, one of them being an agreement on full OA journals. If you take the Swedish, if I remember correctly, agreement, they have 2 agreements with Springer. One that is on full OA and one that is on hybrid journals. So that means the full OA agreement from the Swedes, we don't have it into a collection because there's no question of subscription within it. So we limited later, we didn't begin with that, to Europe Consortium up to 2020, Europe Consortium, because we've seen a different structure from especially the US contracts. And we analyzed the public documents, that is mainly consortium publisher agreements. You got some pieces. So of course, ESAC was a good starting point, but we found at the time only 132 agreements, while all these provided 41 more agreements. Of course, the situation changes through time, and people declare more agreements on ESAC. This is the total of agreement, okay, so you can see nations like the Netherlands, Sweden, Australia, and Germany being very fond of this kind of agreements. That includes, of course, past agreements, while some other countries, including here in our beloved Greece, only 2 agreements that were part of it until 2020. If you look at publishers, you have, of course, a variety of publishers being fully involved into these agreements, going from scholar societies to university presses to commercial publishers. And you have the same of it with it at the end of a distribution with more than 40 being included into our collection. What is interesting, of course, is you see the progression of a number of agreements. And after 2019, it's really rising. And if I had put the 2021, it would have been much more than that, more than 100 have been signed in Europe. One of the results is, were these agreements more binding than the previous subscription one? Of course, we know almost nothing of the distribution of these agreements, but what is really interesting, and we have 29 agreements that only last 1 year, the same thing for 2 years, and we have a very, very, very nice mode here, 3-year agreements. And the longer than 3 years is really rare. Of course, it's a little bit tricky always because you get amendments and so on. So we decided of some rules to decide whether it was the same agreement and a follow-up or a different agreement. Another very interesting result is, of course, we're supposed to live into a transparent world. But if you look closely, there is only a little bit more than 50% of the agreements that are available. I'm stating specifically the text of the agreement is available. And almost 45% is not. And if you look through time, in 2020, it's almost the same proportions. It's a little bit more than 55% only that are available. So you don't see the entrance into a more transparent world. But from a sociological point of view, what is transparency? It could be many different things. Of course, it could be, as I said, registered somewhere. You could have dedicated pages, web pages, or it could be like in the Polish case, for example, you have just a web page saying that they have signed something, but you don't have, a specific page. You don't have any detail or whatever. You have the availability through stable URL. You have a question of a document format. This is really incredible. We're talking about consortium. This is the most, I don't know how to say in English without being, derogatory. You have some documents that are so bad PDF that you could even, you think it's back to 1992 with very bad Xerox processes. It's really incredible. I mean, we're talking about transparency. You're giving us a very shitty PDF that's almost impossible to read from a human point of view, not talking about, of course, a machine point of view. And I should say, because I've said that JISC is the exception with having only point doc formats. All the documents are in English with the exception of one country, you can guess what? France, of course. French language and so on. So the 2 French are only in English, and all the Hungarian was also only in Hungarian. The rest of it is bilingual. You got the translation, like the edited translation that is really nice of the Hungarian agreements. You've got the document content too, that is, okay, it's available, but is it integrally available? It depends. You get removed or inked parts, financial information, especially details, but also many other stuff. And talking about financial information, you can have global sums and some institutional costs in some cases and financial formulas. But is how in practice is money being counted, and does it depend, for example, on the number of publications or not? And in these cases, of course, it's really scarce information. It really depends, and I will go to that in a moment. So transparency, of course, is not the rule, far from it. And because we had this conversation yesterday, it depends on the negotiator. This is not a question of freedom of information law. This is a question of making it a condition to make an agreement. And there's a funny thing in an example of the German agreement. I think it's Weiler, but maybe it's Springer. I think it's Springer. Springer said, okay, we consider this agreement to be our property. But because they insisted it, okay, we make it public. I shall add that in the age of electronic information, there are only 2 documents that have a DOI. That's the 2 deal agreements. The rest doesn't have a DOI. There can be changes from web addresses from one day to another, which happened to GISC. So this is not stable, transparent information. Okay, some results. We studied 4 things, that is the morphology of agreements, the contract objects, the finances, and the overall world. I will talk only a part of it. So the morphology, to give you just an idea of what we're talking about. Okay, the largest one is almost 500 pages. And the smallest one is only 7 pages. So you see, it's both agreements. Of course, sometimes you have very long journal lists, and they are part of it. Sometimes they don't exist at all because they are into an annex and different documents. So you can see the distribution. You have very different agreements. And if you're looking at the model, how it is really made, we have a few models. The Springer Compact is really typical of a certain model. I won't get into detail. You got the two-part structure that is very common, and especially the Hungarian model that is really, once again, special. And there's an atypical structure, typically the Elsevier-Couperin agreement. You can see sometimes the traces of a publisher in a format, and sometimes the traces of a consortium being, always having the same structure and following a certain model. If you look at this subscription part, of course, there are many librarians here, and they know what these documents are about. Me, as a non-librarian, I had no idea because they were not available in public. So what do we see? Okay, we got journal lists, that's for sure. We got the question of collections. That is important in some cases. That is, you can have access to collections A, to collection B, to collection C, to the whole things, and so on. You got the question of archive, and you got the question of post-termination access, which is often really well detailed. And now, once again, part of a standard contract like, no, we don't want to pay again to have access just to this past content. There's something that has been unearthed by Lisa and Schliff into a recent paper, that is the idea that one of the effects is to extend the subscription part of the contracts to institutions. We've not systematically followed that because we didn't have a previous subscription agreement. But I can say that in some cases it is very clear there's a kind of level up. That is, everybody starting at the same line, and you got some money that is given to a publisher to have this, let's say, complementary access for some institution that didn't have it before. So one important part, and a very tricky part of a question how we name this, is some ventilation. That is this idea that you have or not to get some money for reading and to get some money for publishing. And that leads to what we would call accounting techniques. And of course, it depends on what you want to show. That is very important into the naming of the agreements, but that doesn't change a thing. The question is at the end, how much money are you going to get from a publisher point of view? How much money would you give from the consortium point of view? So imagine you have some water into a bathtub. And at the beginning, it's cold water, it's subscription. You can have a model which is the offset, which is not popular anymore. That is, more and more money of the subscription is being put into publication at, for example, a given APC price, and you're changing the water from cold to tepid. Another one, of course, is the publishing rate, which is you're doing things all together, but is you don't know what is the part of a read and the part of a publish. The read and publish is just the opposite. You pretend to say, I'm going to pay this for the read and this for the publish. There are just two different ways of expressing the same thing. But is in the end, I'm going to pay for the whole bathtub. There are two other kinds that we found. One, we called it the read and free articles. You get a little kettle of hot water that you can put into your bath, but it's kind of free. Sometimes they're even called vouchers, for example, or waivers. So it's free, it's a bonus. And the other one that is really interesting in some agreements is the read and discount. So you pay for read only, but you have a discount on APC. Would it be full OA journals or hybrid journals, depending. So you have a discount, but that's not part of the agreement in the sense that the money doesn't come from the libraries. It comes from someone else. Okay, one important thing if we get to the publishing part is the publishing workflow. There have been a few papers showing how much effort it has been for publishers, but also for consortium to build all that in order for the contract to work. We got 5 characteristics that are always there. First, always the recall of the editorial independence. Like, you sign the agreement, but you don't have a right to publish. That means it's scientists and peers that are going to decide whether you publish or not. So we're not a predatory publisher, basically. There are other things, the eligibility. The author identification, you got different system in which you have a single checking or a double checking. You got, of course, the funds management, which is sometimes very, very complicated. You got solutions like, for example, the GISC solution on many contracts is first come, first served. You can imagine what are the consequences. In others, it's very different. And of course, you got the question of the monitoring, and that is coming mostly from the consortium side. That is, you have to tell us how many articles, how many money is left in the case of APC funds, and so on. You got the publishing options. Like, this is really a menu à la carte, as we could say in French or in good French English. First thing, very, very important, the perimeter. We have in our collection almost it's half and half. Half is hybrid and full OA, half is only hybrid. Okay, with very different, you can imagine, options. And when I'm saying hybrid and full OA, that could be the same financial mechanism, that is, whether you publish here or there, it doesn't change a thing, or very different mechanisms. Like on one side, you got an APC fund, on the other side, you have a discount. The licenses, this is a total mess. I could show you the graph, but it's impossible to read. We got every one that is available depending on contract, except CCBA and CSA. That's the only one. So you got sometimes 1, you got sometimes 2, you got sometimes 3, you got sometimes 4, it depends. The question of obligation, apart from the Swedish contracts, you can't say that authors are obliged to publish open access through the agreement. It's always stated like something like has the options and blah, blah, blah. The Swedish contracts say something like, for example, Elsevier could not offer the researcher something else than publishing in CCBY. So this is something that is close to obligation, and then you got the technical workflow, of course, around it. The question of green OA, there's one contract that is the exception, and I could answer some question about, which is the Elsevier Couperin. Apart from it, sometimes the green archive is mentioned and so on, or the fact that you can, actually that's the publisher policy, you can actually, with zero embargo, archive everything you want, but there's no strict workflow mechanism with this exception of the French agreement. The payer model, it's all the same. Of course, we know that, for example, University of California Digital Library has experimented with a multi-payer model, which doesn't exist into our agreements. And finally, very, very important, the question of offers. Almost all agreements only rely on corresponding offers. And even more, in the most recent ones, corresponding offer has been changed because, in some disciplines there are more than one corresponding offer. In something like the offer who actually manages all the stuff with the publisher into the workflow of submission. So, of course, it's very different. And if you pretend that you can publish whatever is being written into a certain country, of course, it's most often limited to the corresponding author. Okay, so this is the complicated part. I make it here very, very simple. What kind of sum volume relationships you can have? With the consequence that is, do you know how much you're going to receive or how much you're going to pay when you sign the contract? There are many that have a fixed sum volume, typically British GISC agreement, where you have like you have this, you pay that, you know the number of articles, and so on and so on. But then you can have lots of corridor contracts. That is, between this and that, you pay exactly the same, so it depends, you have more or less articles. Or the sum can, you have to pay more until you have this number of publications, then it ends. Or it doesn't end. That is, you can have a classic APC applying with or without discount over. So you're still part of the agreement, you're still part of the workflow, but you come back to the classic APC. Whether it is the institution, the consortium, or the author that is going to pay really is not written most of the time. And you have two other models. The pay-as-you-publish model. The more you pay, the more you publish, the more you pay. And finally, the unlimited volume. So you have the fixed sum, but the volume here is unlimited. Limited to a perimeter of journals and so on, but you can publish as much as you want. So this is the all-you-can-eat buffet. For example, into some recent agreements with Elsevier in Sweden, Netherlands, and the last year, optional year of the Swiss universities agreement. What is important to understand is that these agreements are really two words into one agreement. There's no tepid water, in fact, because the subscription and publication part can have different journal lists. They have different workflows. They don't concern the same person. The readers are not authors, and especially not corresponding authors. So in fact, it's two different worlds mixed into a single agreement, which makes it absolutely non-transformative into this other sense, that is the idea that you're going to transform the business of academic publishing. With one exception, of course, well known, that is the ACM agreements, in which you have, let's say, the publisher has said by 2029, all its journals are going to be full OA journals, following a certain, let's say, transformative journal path. So these are non-transformative agreements. Should we be surprised? No. Why? It has never been the aim of the agreement in any way. If you look at Europe principle, like libri, there's no way you can look at the principles, there's no way they're talking about transforming the business of publishing. They're not interested in that. They are not research founders into the Coalition S. They are a consortium of libraries who wants to use in a different way the same money. They're not interested into transforming the business of publishing through these agreements. They can have the personal opinion of their principles, but when they negotiate, it is not part of a deal. It has never been, and it probably will never be. So, of course, there are non-transformative agreements in that sense. They're not going to transform directly the economy. Still, does at least makes the cost lower. This is a very complicated question. Here I take the example of the Elsevier deals. If you look within the contract, do the sum evolve from one year to another? They can go up, they can be the same, or they can go down. Of course, this is once again accounting techniques. That is, you have a fixed sum on which you've agreed for 5 years, let's say, or 3 years. And you can say that the first year is like this, or the final year is like that. And in some cases, you can't say it from the beginning, or you don't have the information. Now, if you look at the evolution from one contract to another, for the Netherlands, it has gone up. For the Swedes, it has gone down. At least they say so, and we come to the next slide. For Couperin agreement, it depends. It depends why? Because there's a discount on APC, so you don't know on this part whether it will have a financial effect on the total sum. So the Swedes, that's the same, you recognize it, but published into also how do you say that you've spared some money? You say it by, one, signing an unlimited agreement. Your aim is to terminate the in the wild APCs. And two, calculated what would have been the cost, that's the red line, if you hadn't signed it. What would have been the subscription cost if you had agreed on the inflation put by the publisher. And finally, the orange line is that. Of course, from, let's say, a mathematics or accounting basic knowledge, this is rising. But for them, and this is not a criticism from my point of view, this is just the economics they're deploying, is it has gone down because it should have been the red line. If you look at usage, of course, you got different views. For example, this is from the Finnish consortium. They're saying it's working really well. Look at Springer. You got everything that is going up, and the other ones are partial transformative agreements. But you got also monitoring from other persons, like especially Springer, of course. I forgot that. Springer is saying, yes, we got 95%, everything is working. Of course, they had no data. This is pure PR. And is it 95% of the people that get into the workflow? Is it 95% of what should have been published? We don't know. They just say it's working very well. Okay, nice for them. And there's also, let's say, independent monitoring. For example, Christian Kurknecht, a kind of Swiss colleague, a little bit crazy, but I like it. So he's built on Elsevier API his own monitoring, and he's showing, for example, that many papers that are available with corresponding order are not being published for the arguments, so they're not OA. So for him, it's a failure, especially considering that the sum is a fixed sum. So that is, it's money that has been spent without any result. So he's made also other things on the Netherlands case, and it's very different, and I don't have time to go through this. So two different things in conclusion. First thing, of course, why are TAs so different from one another? Because the objectives of the negotiation are very different from one consortium to another. It could be, that's just an example, to flip subscription paper into OA, and then you're doing hybrid journals only, and that's it, and you're using, for example, an APC fund, hoping to make it the right size. Of course, we've seen some cases in which it was not the case, both undersized and oversized. Or you can have a distribution of costs and risk, and you can make a publish and read with unlimited publication, for example, on hybrid journals. You can pay a fixed sum for the whole production, like the Swedes have done it. Or you can make OA publication a bonus service, and you can have just a discount based on a subscription contract. Or you can even say, I want to avoid lock-in, so you have just a read and free articles, part of it as a bonus. And finally, you can just have principles that you want to respect, and you make no deal, like the German did it with Elsevier. And let's remember that JISC took like 7 rounds of negotiation to sign with Elsevier just a month ago. So it really depends on the objectives, and also, of course, the results are very different. Finally, I think it's the final one, I would like to say, of course, subscribe to open is very important, because here we're talking about legacy journals that are subscription going to OA, and I think that's a very nice one. But here, I just want to point out how Europe is very special into the whole landscape. We've come from a big deal to these kind of agreements. In some cases, no deal, like the Swedes for 2 years with Elsevier, like the German with Elsevier, like other smaller deals. Or you can come back to almost subscription, and that's it. That's Europe. The US is very, very, very different. In the US, you got no deal, not on the base of you don't make our articles away, but on the base you cost too much considering the services what we have, or the usage that we measure. And of course, this is not consortium that are saying that. This is individual libraries for which the big deal is not that interesting considering, let's say, the single needs of their users compared to very largely needs of European national communities. And of course, they can also unbundle, which is unseen to my knowledge in Europe. That is, they just break the big deal and they just keep, let's say, a tiny or small part of a journal. So just to tell you that even if you have this kind of evolutionary view, the big deal is just one way, and you can see beyond the building, and there are other ways that exist. Thanks a lot.